Many thanks, Werner. We'll open this up now to discussion and questions from the committee. Roger.
Yes, Werner, thanks very much for that presentation. And so I have, I guess, a philosophical question here. Is there a truth that we're trying to capture and characterize with this ontological perspective, or does our perspective dictate what we see, or essentially do we dictate the truth? Is there a truth out there that we can find with the right ontology, or does the ontology define the truth?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Now, within the discipline of ontologies, I'm a realist. And realists believe that there is indeed a truth outside, and that it is our job to discover it. There are other disciplines, like nominalists. They say, well, no, there are no different types, and it's just our imagination. When we see certain similarities, we imagine that there is something more abstract around it. If you look at the theoretical philosophers, how they are divided currently, 99.5% are the realists. So they really believe that there is an objective truth out there.
Questions from others? Oh, yes, David.
It's really more of a comment, and I apologize if this is obvious to some of you, but I think this is a really important issue, and I will leave it to those of you who are more skilled in the biological origins of TMD and so on to debate what things should be called. But I have been on a lot of guideline committees and developed a lot of algorithms over the years, and this is a critical issue in terms of something that we've all talked about already, which is where the insurance coverages drop between the cracks. This type of specificity that Werner is talking about is extremely important in terms of what is it that's covered, what is it that you're paying for, what is the disease process, what are the symptoms, how do they relate to what it is that you're trying to define. And I think that I won't say that that's the only problem here, but that lack of specificity has, I think, contributed to some of what we've talked about and what some of the patients are experiencing in terms of the what they describe as a disjunction between the head and the rest of the body. So just a comment about, I don't want to minimize the importance of this issue.
I totally agree with you, and the perspective of illness and disease and sickness is exactly about what you are saying. So the sickness, for the insurance company, they are only interested when it is at the level of sickness, which overlaps with the disease, the real entity, what is there in the patient. Yes.
Hey, Sean?
Werner, thank you. Gave me a lot to think about and take a lot of notes. David already commented on kind of the clinical implications of this. I'm going to focus on the research. Presumably this model would act as a research framework that would help improve the way that we investigate mechanisms of TMD, that we identify predictors, prognostic variables, modifiable and non-modifiable factors to prevent the progression of this. My question to you is, I imagine that's what you're, in a way, pitching here. Are there precedents for this? Are there examples of where this ontological framework, when applied rigorously to a medical problem, has led to improvements in our understanding of that condition?
Yes, this model is applied in a variety of ways already. The multiple sclerosis communities, which started here from Buffalo and from here it's spread out, they are using this model. Within precision medicine, it is being used. We have colleagues who are working on trying to explain what exactly the functions of a drug are, and trying to, within the framework of systems biology, see what the effect is of individual molecules, what do they in the body, and when you have a bunch of drug molecules operating together, what consequences that has in the physiological mechanism and so on. And those things are used even outside medicine. So I didn't mention the name, but the ontology of general medical science is itself a descendant of the basic formal ontology. And the basic formal ontology is something that was developed by Barry Smith and colleagues, and in which I became a member of the group later on, has become an ISO standard. And it's now already mandatory to be used in the Army and in the intelligence community, in the Navy, by the Air Force, and so on.
Srinivasa?
Thank you. So one of the take-home messages from Werner's presentation was this three broad classes of or entities: the biological, the epistemic, and the biopsychosocial perspectives. And the question is probably for Bill from his morning's presentations, in terms of the clusters of phenotypes that you presented. Would any of these clusters help in defining these perspectives?
Can somebody who is closer to the microphone repeat the question, because I couldn't understand it?
Yeah, Werner, the question is whether some additional or different approaches may converge on similar findings. So this is Bill Maxner, and I'm just was asked the question as to whether some of the machine learning and clustering methodologies which we've used to stratify patients into different groups, whether in fact there may be some convergence using ontology as a mechanism of stratifying patients towards personalized medicine. I think it would be very interesting to look at the ontology of a machine learning clustering agnostic process similar to what we've done with what you would be doing in ontology, to see if we can in fact identify in parallel processes similar populations. And in our case, it would be more in your biopsychosocial or in the pathophysiological domain. But it would be interesting to see if we can come to common agreement with the two different methods.
I agree, and for a certain, ideally, if unless the TMD community is talking totally nonsense, right, which I do not believe that is the case, then if you take such an approach, you will find a certain overlap. The problem might be, specifically with the deep learning, that the systems will not be able to tell you why that is the case, while an ontological analysis will be able to tell you that. So one of the aspects that I didn't go into here is that we do not, when you do a traditional statistical analysis, you put your variables all next to each other. When you put your variables in an ontological model, you will see that they are related in other ways than you would expect, on top of ways that you do expect. Now, statistics will find out the ways that you do expect them, but very rarely the other ones. So that's why you really are better off with a combination of the two.
So Werner, in today's session, there have been 3 patients who've provided perspectives regarding their experiences with TMD, and it was noticed that for all 3 of them, their TMDs began with some type of dental treatment. And I think it's fair to say that dental education has, and what we know about the functioning of the jaw system, is relatively simplistic. And with that, within that simplicity, I believe that we sometimes try to do treatments of a mechanical nature that are probably not in line with the emerging complexity of the system. And so one of the things I was struck by in your presentation today was that through an ontological approach, and this really dovetails with a prior presentation as well, looking at the comparing where we are in understanding the mascatory system with where the physiology of the cardiovascular system was decades ago in terms of integrating, the multiple layers of a system. What I'm struck by is that the mascatory system looks simple. It's clearly anything but simple. And how I was interpreting part of your presentation was an ontological approach as a way to begin to unpack a lot of that complexity, and particularly, as you and I had discussed earlier this week, this notion of time, and what we think of as a phenotype at time 1 and a phenotype at time 2, they may not be the same phenotype, and yet currently we use the same label as though it is the same entity moving across time, and whereas in your work you're clearly indicating that that need not be the case. And so we have a system that is unfolding across time. It is temporally dependent, and one of the things that I think you're really highlighting is that you provide tools and a language for beginning to unpack that stuff into its components, by which, if we go back to Roger's question about, are we taking a realist approach here or not, I'll sidestep that because I'm a critical realist, not a realist, and I think that Roger's question could eventually be answered in the affirmative.
Yeah, I agree, and I must say, for the questions and the comments that have been raised after my presentation, it seems to be the very first time that I've been able to make myself reasonably clear. So, which is
I've heard you speak many times over the years, Werner, at meetings around the world, and I have to agree. This was stunningly clear today. Because let me back up. Because I spent 2 hours with Werner on Monday, and Werner was amused with how much I did not understand. And so I want to thank you with taking our conversation and really translating it into something that even I could understand today. Other questions here today? So I think we can close this session. Do you have any last words, Werner? Because one of the things I'm interested in, and it was some material that was in your original draft, and it was an outline of a research program, and it's here in this slide, but in text form, not graphical form, of classifying variables by the 3 perspectives. What would be involved in actually doing that in terms of effort and resources?
Well, I mean, I think we can start with the data that exists already, right? So there have been so many research that is already going on. What needs to be done is to taking a look at the raw data and see whether we can classify those different elements in terms of those perspectives that I've provided. That would be the first step.
And what about resources necessary to do that?
You want me to say that here off the top of my head? It depends on the size of those materials, of course, and who would be worked. In any case, there would be, we need people who worked on those studies themselves. Okay, so when, for instance, the data dictionaries are not clear enough that we can ask clarifications for them, we need to have people who are fully aware of what the problems are and who can maybe translate what I am saying into a lingo that's more palatable for the TMD experts. And Richard, you are a good guy for that. And then you need extremely good ontologists, and there is no better one than me, so that's an indispensable.
So based on your prior funded work with a variety of data sets, this was NIDCR funded on ontology of orofacial pain, which was a 2-year project. I think you spent 3 years working on it with continuing funds. My guess is that what we're looking at here is probably something like a 5-year project in order to actually reach some kind of definitive statement that would be ontologically sound and which would, from that perspective, begin to answer our question of what is TMD. Does that seem like a fair statement for this moment?
To be absolutely sure, yes, but I think that already some hypothesis what it will be at the end of the 5 years would already be generated at the end of the first year. So the first part would actually be to clarify the methodology way better than I've been able to do it in those 15 minutes here. So that would be a first step, and now we can train a couple of people to do that, to do the actual amount of the work and divide the effort in that way.
Okay.
Excellent. And all comes, of course, with the same reliability and validity studies in exactly the same way as you have been doing it in the past. So that applies to this methodology as well.
Excellent. Any other thoughts? Yes, Bob.
I'm still confused. Not unusual. Is this implying a reductionist approach or a clustering approach to reaching an essential definition or ontology? I'm not clear which direction we're headed.
So it is definitely not a reductionist approach. That's why exactly I have, can you still see the slides? Okay, well, that's exactly when I gave all those possible things here. So these are just possibilities and there are way more. So if we would say, well, yeah, it's indeed, if we find that this is exactly the right schema, then it reduces indeed complexity. But it is not reductionism in the classical sense, where you ignore entities that exist because they are not useful or not practical or for whatever reason. So realists are not reductionists.
Okay, thank you very much, Werner. I think this has been very, very helpful at pulling together some ideas that have been emerging during today's presentations.
Okay, thank you once again.